Lesley Fox is executive director at the Fur Bearers, a nonprofit charitable organization working to end the commercial fur trade and promoting coexistence with wildlife. She serves on the board of directors for the Society for Humane Science and is president and board chair for the Alberni Community and Women Service Society. Lesley is currently finishing a BA interdisciplinary studies at Royal Roads University. How's the Bachelor of Arts program going, Lesley?
I really enjoy it. I really think the answer to all of our problems is in disciplinary studies. We could talk more about that after.
Well, and do you have a focus?
Interdisciplinary studies is the focus. So it's looking at the intersections of various disciplines. And so for myself, I'm very interested in the intersectionality of, people, animals, and the environment. And I find those three issues always overlap. And so it's looking at that part where they overlap that I think we can finally make some progress. So interdisciplinary studies is a really great program.
Yeah, it's nice to be sort of connect things. We tend to work in our compartments, but it's really important to connect up. And so is there already sort of a faculty around that and studies around that, or
Yeah, it's its own discipline. So just like you would have, psychology, communications, interdisciplinary studies is its own discipline, and so it really doesn't get the recognition that it deserves. But it basically, I think the concept of interdisciplinary studies is that kind of what you were saying is people are in their own lane with their own lens, and that's how they look at things. And that perspective comes from our education, also sometimes our culture, how we've grown up. So, whether you're an engineer, a doctor, a mom, First Nations, a senior, a child, an artist, we approach topics wearing almost like these glasses, right? If that's how we see it in this from this specific viewpoint. But I think that's also creates a lot of limits and barriers because we're unable to see outside of that. We only see things the way we want to see them and how we were trained to see them. And so interdisciplinary studies really calls upon us to take off our glasses, put on someone else's glasses, and keep going, right? And keep going all around. And so you start to think differently is really what it enables you to do, because it does combine all these different perspectives. And it's sort of through that approach, again, you really start to, that's where invention comes from, right? Because you're able to kind of come at it from a different place, and you can get to solutions, and you can get to places that typically we're not able to because it's redundant. We see the same problem, we see the same solutions, and we get stuck. So to me, that's what interdisciplinary studies is all about. That's what I'm doing, my education right now with Royal Roads, and I hope to continue to pursue. And as I mentioned, I think I'm most compelled when I see these issues related, animals, people, and the environment. And for me, the overarching theme is typically oppression, and it manifests in different ways. But really what we're fighting is oppression. And I think when we can talk about oppression more broadly and respectfully, you kind of get more at the root of it, and start to break down some of those big systems that uphold oppression. So things like, patriarchal systems, commerce, certain government, systems, outdated laws and policy. It's fascinating. I have a lot of fun with it.
That's really awesome. Yeah, this whole idea that we have to be an expert, I think I grew up with that. You have to pick something and you have to be an expert at it, but it's not. It's much more beneficial to have this sort of holistic view, right? And try to see. I studied English in a Bachelor of Arts program. When I went to University of Victoria, I wanted to study like humanities. I wanted to study social history and women's studies and environmental. I wanted to create my own sort of degree, and it took me a while to realize they're not going to let me do that. Like I had to pick something, so I picked English because I figured, well, English, you could read anything, right? So it encompasses everything. But this idea of taking off your glasses and putting on the glasses of someone else, I think through English, like just through literature, you can do that because you have to see what is this character doing and what did this author intend. And I think that's really ultimately what education should be is learning how to think for ourselves, right? Not just assuming a body of knowledge, but learning how things connect and stuff. So within this interdisciplinary faculty, then the animal people environment connection, is that something that they've already established, or that must be new kind of territory, right?
Not quite there yet, which is what I'm excited to sort of bring to the table. And so I think there's an appreciation for that because already, as you said, I think interdisciplinarians have a critical thinking mindset. So they already have some of the nuts and bolts that enable them to be open enough to consider these different viewpoints. It's interdisciplinary studies is typically, there's a real social justice, I think, component of it. And social justice tends to be very human oriented, right? So it's, which is great. I think we can round that out a little bit to include, the environment and animals. And I would argue that the environment and animals is a social justice issue also. It doesn't get the fanfare, of course, because there's all kinds of other competing priorities and they're valid as well, right? So it's just sort of creating this balance. So the program, like I said, there's a big social justice component, LGBTQ, First Nations. There are courses, environmental ethics, as that I've taken that I find really interesting. And then communications is a big part of it as well. Crisis communications, messaging, marketing, gender is a big one as well, and defines how we see a lot in gender roles and the relationship between sex and gender and sort of societal attitudes. So it's been a lot of fun, but I agree. I when I was younger, I really struggled with the set menu. When you go to school and there's this set menu of this is your schooling, and I found that really confining and frustrating. And as a result, school wasn't really an option for me when I was younger. The courses just weren't there to capture my interest. And so I went to university and I didn't finish my degree back then. And I got a dream job. And so my life kind of happened backwards. And so now I find myself wanting to expand my education. And now that I'm older, I think the discipline and focus. And then of course, now it's a brand new day. There's been a lot of change in various universities and institutions about the courses they're offering. And now, you can get a degree in animal welfare, animal ethics, social justice programs galore. So I really love it, and it's been a lot of fun.
Cool. Professors really enjoy older students too, I think, because I was a mature student, as they said, and because we're there because we really want to be there. We're not there because we're kind of on this track and we just want to get finished, right?
Mm-hmm.
Kind of savor it in a different way, I think.
You do. And you can apply some life experience as well and some lived experience. And so you engage with the content a little bit better because you have something, you've got, some of that experience. So it's been fun.
And you bring like this world of experience from the fur bearers, right? I mean, what great knowledge and wisdom you've accumulated there. So let's talk a little bit about what's going on. One of the things I was thinking about when we had our massive heat wave, which is not going to be the last one, it was really a reminder to me that climate change is real and the climate crisis is here, and this is probably our new normal within the next 5-10 years. Is more of this intense heat. It was really hard to function. And I mean, I was thinking about the animals and the birds and the squirrels and the deer and all the urban creatures that we love so much. What kind of things can we do? What should we be thinking about in supporting them, not interfering with them, but how can we support them through these, especially the summer, I think, in Canada?
I'm so glad you asked that question. And I think traditional media isn't doing a great job of covering the animal component. So there's lots of information about how to, cool cool yourself down in your home or, as a human, but we're not talking about these animals. So it's great to talk about that. Thank you. We just published a couple blogs, so people can go to our website. It's thefurbearers.com, and then we've got some tips up there. But just briefly, so I think I'd probably say first and foremost, number one is tolerance. And so when the weather gets really hot, animals are more easily found in some of our spaces, right? So they too are seeking sources of water. So they might show up at some of these watering holes that we go to. They might be looking for shade. So they could be, in our backyards or trying to seek shade or shelter in our gardens or under a tree. So we're trying to encourage people to just be really tolerant and mindful that they too are struggling, and to give them lots of space and not to interfere, try and get up close, take photos, feed them. So again, just try to keep a distance, and just the tolerance proximity of being mindful that they're struggling. There is a bit of a debate about water and leaving water out, sources of water. So on one hand, there's some messaging around, we don't want to encourage animals to linger too long in our backyards, because that can create some negative interactions. But at the same time, certainly it's a really unprecedented time. And so there's some recommendations to leave small amounts of water out. So perhaps, a couple bowls around your yard, really shallow, just a little bit of just fresh water, drinking water. And that's great for, birds, insects, butterflies, small animals like squirrels, rabbits, skunks, raccoons. And as long as it's not there regularly, the idea being is we want to encourage animals, of course, to move on their way and to continue doing what they do in accessing natural sources, but a little bit of water is okay. People can plant shade as well is another thing. So just sort of curate our gardens in a way that is really mindful of wildlife. So providing lots of opportunities for, again, shade, really bushy plants and trees to keep animals cool. And then certainly there's all kinds of information about our companion animals in the house. My mind really goes to the small animals. So there's lots of talk about, cats and dogs. And of course, don't leave your dog in a hot car, walking on pavement, offering extra water, brushing animals regularly. And all that information is really widely available online. My heart really goes out to the small animals, the rodents, the hamsters that are in glass aquariums, mice, gerbils, guinea pigs, rabbits. So in some homes, we have these small animals, and we really need to be mindful of their enclosures and the temperature within some of these enclosures, particularly aquariums, because they can heat up. There's a bit of a lack of ventilation. And so we've included some information on our website to help, people just kind of think about those things. And, you can, if you do have an animal living in an aquarium, to take it down to the basement or a lower level, a cooler level, provide, of course, extra drinking water. Frozen treats are a great idea. Nuts and seeds can be frozen. And then also for animals like hamsters, you can freeze a bottle of water half full, freeze it, wrap it in a towel, and you can put that inside the aquarium to help kind of cool things down. But yeah, it's my heart breaks for the little ones that are often so overlooked during these times.
Right. And what if we're out on a walk or a hike and we see an animal that looks like it's in distress? What should we do in those situations?
Really, really hard. And first and foremost, always call your local wildlife rehab haber. So here in British Columbia, we've got on the island, there's Wild Ark and Souk, and then we've got North Island Wildlife Society here in Mid-Island. On the mainland, Wildlife Rescue in Burnaby. There's also Critter Care. So these are some great places that will give you free advice. And no matter where you live, if you can just reach out to your local wildlife rehabber and describe the situation. And from a safe distance, if you can take photos or videos, that really helps provide some context for what's going on. Take notes of, place, what you're seeing, what time it was. any information about the species, any identifying markers or fur patches or coloring or any kind of detail, and just make sure you get all that together, and you can talk to your wildlife rehabber and they'll provide you with next steps. If intervention is required, there's opportunities for people who are experienced to perhaps come out and they can get the animal. And other times, sometimes it's best to leave them because confinement and transport can cause more stress. And depending on the situation, it could almost make things worse. So it's really case by case basis. So the best thing is, again, to reach out to your local wildlife rehabber for species specific information.
Having been in a couple of those situations myself, I've learned it's a really good idea to make sure, like right now, go put Wild Eye Arc or whatever phone number in your phone, so you're not out there trying to
No, totally. Yes, that's a great
out.
idea. Yeah, I have it in my phone, and you can also print out a little card or whatever you need to do and keep it in your wallet. So if you need to give it to somebody or you just need to have it, sometimes we forget phone numbers. We have it in our phone and it's like automated, and then our phone dies or we lose our phone or something happens, but having a hard copy of those numbers is helpful too. Great idea.
All right. And what about food? Like, should we, and in the winter as well, when should we feed wildlife or not at all?
No, so feeding wildlife is so well documented in the literature. So there's been a lot of peer-reviewed studies that suggest feeding wildlife creates more problems than it solves. And the reason for that is when you provide a food reward, it has the ability to fundamentally change an animal's behavior. In essence, you remove those wild instincts. And it's such a difficult topic, I think, particularly for animal lovers, is that there's such an instinct we have, don't we? When we see an animal, one of our first instincts is to offer food. We offer food to show love, to show care, comfort. We do that even as humans when we share and give food. It's a way of really showing affection and to take care of someone. And we extend those values to animals as well. And which I understand, and I think everyone appreciates. The problem, though, is it's very short-sighted in that, again, it's manipulative in that these animals start to lose their instincts, and particularly urban wildlife. So animals like deer, raccoons, squirrels. Sometimes there's been cases of people feeding coyotes or black bears. And what happens is that these animals then become more comfortable approaching people. And the problem is sometimes they approach the wrong people who don't have those best intentions, who don't want to interact with them, who are scared of their presence, who perceive them to be a nuisance or a pest, and who will phone various officials to come and remove those animals by lethal means typically. So whether it's a pest control company or the BC Conservation Officer Service, those animals, typically the ones that are fed are typically the ones that will be killed. And for those reasons, we encourage people not to feed wildlife. And it's also worth reminding people that in most circumstances, nature provides enough food. So an example is Stanley Park. So for example, there's even further to unpack that. There's coyotes that live in Stanley Park. Stanley Park is, for your listeners who aren't familiar with Vancouver, Stanley Park is the gem of the city. It's this iconic, big natural area. It's the size of the city itself, and home to a variety of wildlife. And people go to the park to feed animals like coyote, provide them treats. They want that up close experience. They want that contact, that intimacy. But what's happening right now is that it's fundamentally changing behavior of coyotes. So now coyotes are crossing busy highways to approach people to access a food reward. They are, coming up to joggers or cyclists wanting a food reward. And in some cases, their behavior becomes aggressive now, where there's been a rising number of bites. So coyotes are nipping at people to access a food reward because they're wildlife. So they're sort of socially awkward. So it's the same principle with your dog at home. When you offer a food reward, there's a behavior expectation. Coyotes are also canids. They're dogs when you offer food reward, there's a behavior expectation. And the whole thing just, you can see where this is going. And coyotes in Stanley Park, again, there's lots of natural food sources. Coyotes eat squirrels, rabbits, voles, mice, rats, also some vegetation. So there's really no reason to provide food for these animals when there's such an abundance there already. And again, I think when we consider feeding wildlife, oftentimes I know at the risk of offending some people, it's selfish in nature. It's about us, right? It's about our experience and our interaction, getting up close, getting that photo, getting the selfie, feeling as though we're doing something that makes us feel good. And I think it requires that self-discipline to create that space where, while this might make us feel good, the long-term implications for that individual have far-reaching consequences. And so again, it is a bit of a self-discipline issue to show restraint. It's not helping.
Right. Better to do whatever we can to promote their wild spaces.
Yeah. Give them access to food.
And for example, there's a tree in our parking lot area here that I noticed the local deer eat. And during this drought, of course, this tree is dying. So I'm trying to water the trees, so that, like that sort of thing, right? Instead of
preserve their natural habitat, which has the natural food sources, and giving them lots of space as well when they are accessing food. Creating that distance so we don't scare them away. Another good example are berries. So berry pickers go out and take all the berries. Well, berries are a wild food source for many bears, for example. And so there's some evidence to suggest that when people are over picking berries or over harvesting, salmon is another one. Our salmon stocks are, I hate to use the word stock, salmon populations, are there's a lot of concern about salmon populations right now. And so when humans are taking the salmon for themselves, we're removing these natural food sources for animals, again, like grizzly bears or black bears, who completely depend on salmon, particularly just before hibernation, where the salmon provide a lot of calories for bears. And so, again, just sort of staying out of the way when it comes to just being mindful of what we're taking and consuming for ourselves, and making sure that we're always leaving enough for those who really need it and depend on it.
It seems to always come back to the just leave them alone mentality is really what being vegan is, right? So leave them alone. And also to make that extra connection with the salmon, I understand that the bear then take the salmon into the forest and leave the carcasses, which feeds the forest. So part of the reason we have the ancient forests is so we don't need to eat the salmon, and we need to just leave them alone. And there are actually even salmon alternatives now, plant-based alternatives. So
Sure.
I admit that was the last food I think that I eventually gave up, because it is delicious. I accept that, but we're at a time now where we just need to do everything we possibly can. Yeah. So there's some good news then on the fur front. Yay. Did you ever think you'd see this day, Lesley?
There's been so much news. So quick recap for your listeners. There's been some major announcements as it relates to fur, the issue of fur. So, killing animals for fashion, for bits of trim on coats or luxury products. So in the last few weeks, major announcements coming out of Canada Goose was probably the most significant. Canada Goose is a international company. They're American owned. They used to be Canadian owned, but they sold out a while back to the States. And they manufacture outerwear, specifically is what they're known for, although they do have other, clothing and watches. I believe they're getting into jewelry and some other high-end items. But for a very long time, Canada Goose manufactured a series of parkas that featured exclusively coyote trim on the hoods. And of course, their jackets also have down in them, which the down issue hasn't been addressed yet. Not down, of course, comes from goose feathers. But Canada Goose, nonetheless, announced that they would be fur-free, I believe. I don't have it handy with me, the date exactly, but very soon that they will be ending and phasing out their use of real fur. Also, Holt Renfrew, which is a major department store, announced that they will be ending fur sales. Saks Fifth Avenue and Neiman Marcus also announced an end to fur sales recently. So really significant announcements coming from some of sort of the last holdouts, I would say, as it relates to the fur issue. Some of the big players who staunchly defended their position, promoted fur widely, that we never really thought we'd see the day. And in fact, it's a brand new day. What's really fascinating is in most cases, these companies have cited sustainability as being the prime motivator for them to end the use of fur in their product lines.
Is that financial sustainability?
Potentially. I'm sure they recognize financial gain by opening their products up to, you know, a whole other market. But many of the companies are saying that they want to lighten their carbon footprint, and that it's really difficult to do with fur. And that is true. You know, fur is very carbon intensive as it relates to the environment, you know, so raising an animal for almost a year and all of the energy and, you know, water that would go into fur farms. Also, trapping is energy intensive as well, gasoline and, you know, policing trap lines. And then you've got to prepare the pelt. The pelt gets shipped, goes to an auction, and then international buyers come. The pelt then gets tanned with chemicals and then would be manufactured, and then those products then shipped. So it has an enormous carbon footprint in terms from, you know, cradle to grave concept when we think about sort of a product lifetime of a product. So I think for them to really have an impact as it relates to the environment, they have to make some changes. And fur is an easy one to cut. Let's be honest, it's just over, isn't it? I think that society is ready for it. I think that this pandemic and this idea of living post-pandemic really, really calls upon us to consider our relationship with animals. Of course, the origins of COVID itself, you know, came out of what is essentially a zoonotic disease. And that there's this disease transfers from people to animals, and it's a great opportunity, I think, for that reflection. And so the fur trade is a real easy one. It's real low hanging fruit here, people. so we're watching it. We're watching history unfold.
Well, and you know, the cynic in me, having been an activist for this long, I think that saying it's sustainability is their main reason is a bit of a PR spin. It plays nicely into their image. I think really that it comes down to consumers are just not wanting this product anymore. I think we're driving that change, and because of activism, I think all the wonderful activists who've done all kinds of creative ways of trying to wake people up to this, it's finally taking effect. And then with COVID on top, and the connection to the mink farms as well, and so what's going on with the mink farms then in Canada? Because I think they were reopened in British Columbia. They were initially shut down when it was discovered that there were mutations going on in there, and then they were reopened. I don't really know what's going on there now.
Yeah, so fur farming, we'll start there for your listeners who might be new to the issue of fur farming. So fur farming is the industrialization and production of animals for luxury products or for fashion. So animals are raised in cages. They're typically killed by their first birthday. The skins are removed and sent all over the world, again, to manufacture into clothing, trim, trinkets, accessories, that type of a thing. So the statistics are really hard. So it's hard to really know how many fur farms are left in Canada. At last count, I believe it was sitting around 100. Those are statistics from Statistics Canada 2018. We suspect that number is much lower, just for a lot of different reasons. There's no future in fur, so as a result, many are closing. In British Columbia is the third largest fur farming province in Canada. Nova Scotia is first, followed by Ontario, and then of course BC. We have 11 fur farms here, 10 mink farms, 1 chinchilla. And over the last few months, COVID has been discovered on 3 farms. And the farms were ordered that had COVID were ordered under quarantine. Not all farms were closed, just the ones affected by COVID. And then this past spring, were given the green light to begin breeding again, which we were absolutely shocked that the government would allow that, knowing mink are susceptible to COVID. Mink can get COVID, they can transmit COVID, people can give COVID to mink. It goes back and forth, and it's been found all over the world on fur farms, all over the world, in Europe, countries like Denmark, France, Italy, Greece, Spain, wow. and in the US as well, Wisconsin, Michigan, Washington, Oregon. So we're really seeing that COVID is having an enormous effect on fur farming. And we're missing that political will component. And so the fur bearers for many years have been working to phase out fur farming for obvious reasons. And you know, now that we've got sort of this link to human health, it's really catapulted this issue into the spotlight in a way that it's never been before. It's really, really difficult generally to get animal issues into the spotlight, and fur farming even more so, because it's so obscure. Most people don't even know that fur farms exist, and most people are surprised to know that they exist so close to our urban centers. BC's fur farms are just in the Fraser Valley. It's a 40-minute drive from Vancouver, and they're there, and they're sprawling. They're one farm typically holds tens of thousands of individuals. So these farms are so much closer to home than people think. It's just an issue people don't know about, they're not aware about. They think that it's happening somewhere else in the world. But it's right here. It's right here in British Columbia, and the bulk of it is shipped overseas. So there's no benefit. There's no social or economic benefit to British Columbians. You know, certainly there's animal welfare concerns, there's environmental concerns, and now we've got this human health component here. So we've really stacked the deck as it relates to sort of the business case of why we should end fur farming. It's airtight. It's just this political will mechanism of how do we create the political will and interest to take action, real action. And my frustration, I think, with that is that there's so many competing interests, and it makes animal advocacy so hard, because like you identified earlier in our conversation, the climate crisis is here and now. We literally have over 200 forest fires burning in BC. We have an opioid crisis. We have a pandemic. We have poverty issues and homelessness, major housing problems, you know, like, so keep going down the list of all these things that we're grappling with, and throw in fur farms. And you can now quickly see where on the list of priorities fur farms is going to be. And that's the hard part. And that's the part as it relates to political will, right? Is that we've got all these competing priorities, and those priorities are deserving. Residential schools, like, huge priority. And I should have probably listed that right off the top, is that we have this discovery now of all these mass graves. And so giving space and room for Indigenous voices, absolutely essential right now. And again, all this mix of stuff that's just so deserving of all this space and airtime, and where are animals in that? And as you know, and I know, they just sink lower and lower down the list, and yeah. It's frustrating, because it's all important and it all needs to be dealt with. It's just Logging, I should mention too, actually, is the other
Say
is the
that.
other issue that's top of mind, of course, the old growth logging that's happening. So, I mean, I could go on forever about all these issues that are in some cases literally on fire that need attention.
Yeah, I mean, and some of these are crucial. I mean, well, they're all crucial. You're right, and it makes me wonder what are they doing? Like what? So they're just allowing the clear cutting of forests. I mean, they're saying, okay, we're gonna work to phase out the mink farms. That shouldn't be all that difficult. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not a politician. I did. I was impressed with the document I think I found on your website or in your newsletter about a letter from a variety of different infectious disease physicians, I believe, or specialists to the government saying, look, these mink farms, I think it was specifically about mink farms, right? And the connection. And we got to do something. I mean, yeah, it's government
It's
frustration.
it's great, and like I said, I think what makes me really exciting about this time in history as it relates to fur farming is it's not just an animal rights issue. And I find, and I actually resent that sometimes. And you hear that often from politicians, and the term animal rights is almost sort of condescending in that we're extremists, we're can't be taken seriously, we're a fringe group, we're, and so you're minimized, your voice is minimized because you get branded as an activist. And the word activist sometimes makes people uncomfortable because you're going to do something, and that in essence gets people on edge. You're going to, what do you want to do? You're going to change something, you're going to ban something, and they're inherently uncomfortable. And I think we need to get out of that headspace, because I think activists are what changed the world. And there's been, over time and throughout history, thank God for activists. Otherwise, we'd be stuck in some really crappy situations and institutions.
Well, you and I would be in the kitchen for one.
Exactly. You wouldn't even have this show, right? And have a voice. And so, exactly. So activism is essential. And I resent that it gets minimized by government. And there's this attitude that somehow it's not a valid conversation to have. But what's really helped, I think, with the case of fur farming is it isn't just an animal rights issue. Now you've got a human health problem, you've got an environmental problem, and there's lots of documentation about, and it makes sense that any mass production of animals, you're going to have waste associated with that. The waste goes into local watersheds and creates all kinds of problems. We've also uncovered some labor issues. So, human rights issues, abuses, workers on the farm, conditions that they're enduring. And again, most people who are familiar with animal issues, there's a direct link to how humans are treated. If you don't treat animals well, you're not treating people well, and vice versa. And most recently, the Union of BC Indian Chiefs fur farming issue got their attention, where it's great to have these Indigenous voices saying, wait a second, fur farming is not consistent with Indigenous views and values. And so while fur, yes, is used culturally in many Indigenous communities, the exploitation of animals is not consistent with Indigenous values. And having their voice on this issue and speaking out against fur farming has just been incredible. And of course, what you were saying earlier with this, letter, infectious disease specialists, like, never in my lifetime have I ever seen such a pileup. Talk about interdisciplinary studies, a pileup of all these different interest groups coming together saying, fur farming, are you crazy? It's completely unnecessary. And the costs surely outweigh any possible benefits. And I use the word benefits here quite loosely, as, like I said, it's really, really hard to find any benefit with some of these farms. So
Time to move on for sure, and thankfully that seems to be happening. You guys have a webinar on the 12th with the Union of BC Indian Chiefs representative, an infectious disease physician, the BC SPCA, and the Humane Society, and you. That sounds really fantastic. So people can go to your Facebook, I guess, and find information about that.
yeah, so it's Facebook/fur free.
Okay, cool. And then just in the last 10 minutes we have here, we wanted to talk about a keystone species. So first of all, what is a keystone species and why is the beaver one of those? How do they fit that description and why should we care about them and what can we do to help them?
Oh my gosh, you're speaking all my favorite things. So, and what a timely discussion to have because this directly relates to the fires and climate change and the weather that we're having. So, a keystone species is an animal who other species depend on for their very survival. So, they're kind of the glue that holds it all together as it relates to an ecosystem. And scientists have identified different keystone species. So one of them is a wolf, for example. So a wolf kind of, again, holds the ecosystem all together and that they're a top apex predator. They help manage populations. They can help influence animal behavior. There's a really amazing YouTube video called How Wolves Change Rivers. And I encourage your listeners to check it out. It's fascinating. Another keystone species, salmon. Salmon are so underrated in terms of what salmon even endure for their survival. But also, again, they provide life to our forests. So not only to animals, but as you mentioned earlier in the show about the carcasses of salmon found in forests provide nutrients to the soil, which then replenish trees and forests. So salmon. But probably one of my most favorite species, and I hate to play favorites, but I gotta throw it to the beaver. Beavers are a keystone species, and most people might be surprised to learn that. Beavers historically, of course, Canada was founded on the fur trade, and part of that included beavers. Beavers were sought after by colonizers to create felt hats for Europeans. So throughout the 1600s, 17, 1800s, white settlers almost obliterated our beaver population to satisfy this desire for these silly hats. Now scientists are learning, thank goodness, that beavers are much more than a hat. And in fact, we really missed the boat on that because beavers are nature's firefighters. And some of the terminology that's coming out to describe beavers and the role they play in ecology is really exciting. And again, nature's firefighters, what a cool thing. And so what do you mean nature's firefighters? The easiest way to explain it and summing up all the scientific literature, beavers keep fresh water on the land. Amazing. So when you think about it, we've got these little engineers, these hardworking construction type oriented engineers that are able to expand our ponds, build out tributaries for streams and rivers, collect all this fresh water on the land. And that fresh water is what supports salmon. It's what supports other mammals, insect populations, pollinators. The contribution to all these different species, beavers are really incredible. There's a study that suggests that the wetlands beavers support 43% of endangered species. Amazing. And so in times of drought, forest fire, extreme heat, we can thank the beaver for creating all these little swimming holes, these little pockets, this little oasis type places within our communities. And I think historically, again, we've really misjudged beavers. As some people associate them as being pests or a nuisance. They're merely a rodent. They're in the way, that they destroy trees or they can flood farmland, and all of those issues again are really short-sighted. While beavers can cause issues, there's no doubt they're very busy and sometimes they can find themselves into trouble. There are so many non-lethal options now in which we can mitigate any kind of damage. So excessive tree chewing, we're able to wrap trees, flooding associated with culverts or activity around culverts. There's lots of devices now, pond levelers, beaver deceivers, which is basically some fencing. There's ways that we don't have to trap and kill beavers anymore. That's really such a 1950s way of approaching these situations. And I think, again, our current situation really calls upon us to think differently and do differently, because the benefits of beavers are so important to us, especially at this time we're finding ourselves in as it relates to climate change. And so the urgency is there. Like it is absolutely alarming to me that killing beavers is even allowed under the legislation, given what we know about their contributions to water and creating water. And there's a lot of conversation about water too, particularly fresh water, and some thought that, you know, there's going to be conflicts over water in the future because of how it's managed and it's depleting. And so beavers really play an important role there. And I really hope to hear more about beavers, particularly from the animal community, and this rallying around the importance of beaver, because they're a great bridge between not only as an animal supporting wildlife and as a keystone species, but also their contribution to the environment and keeping our forests intact and keeping that fresh water on the land.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I never thought of it that way, because rivers naturally run to the sea. That's what they do. And so the beavers are just diverting some of that water. And you hear about beavers, flooding farmland, I guess, is probably one of the main concerns about them. But you're saying that there's ways of managing some of these concerns and still allowing the beavers to do what they do naturally. And some of the dams they build are over generations. Right?
So cool. Beavers, they're so fun to learn about. Just a couple quick facts, just to hope to endure your listeners to how adorable beavers are. Beavers live in family groups. They have a monogamous pair. They tend to live 3 generations in a family. So the yearlings and then the kits. The kits are the babies. They have a really fun anatomy to talk about. They're built to swim. Their eyes, they have a third eyelid that acts as swimming goggles. So when they're underwater, they've got great vision and it protects their eyes from debris or sticks. Their ears are like little valves that close up, little submarine when they go under. They are fairly docile. They're inquisitive, they're social, they're curious, they're very hardworking. And what else about beavers? Interesting fact about beavers is they can't live in salt water. And this is really important, particularly for coastal communities. Beavers sometimes will show up around UBC. So they ride the logs from the Fraser River, and then they get sort of mixed up into the ocean and the salt water. And salt water is toxic to beaver. They can quickly dehydrate and get sick. So if you do see a beaver near the ocean or in the ocean, you should call a wildlife rehabber immediately, because some intervention might be required to kind of redirect them to a freshwater source. But they can live in our communities, and they do. Beavers can be found in the city. In Vancouver, you can find a beaver lodge in Olympic Village. You can watch them. There's a path right there, a walkway, and you can watch them. They typically are most active at dusk and dawn. You can find beavers in Stanley Park, several places in Maple Ridge, some of the big parks there, Golden Ears. There's lots of different places. You often hear beavers before you see them. They slap their tail on the water to notify everybody that someone's in the area or there's potential dangers. And so if you listen for some slapping noises, they'll let you know. But you can typically observe beavers in their natural habitat without a lot of problems. They seem fairly tolerant for human observers. Certainly you never want to get close to one or handle one, but you can watch them, from a distance, and they're a lot of fun.
Cool. And are they indigenous to North America? Are they found in other continents as well?
There's the European beaver. I forget how many species of beavers there were. A handful. So there's the North American beaver, the Castor canadensis, and there's a mountain beaver, and a European model. My Latin names are gone, but you can find beavers. They were reintroduced in the UK and Scotland, and some other places in Europe. Beavers were in South America, although I believe they were introduced and it wasn't a success. But beavers are native to North America. They're an integral part of Canada, and because I think we've decimated their population, it's really shown, because we've removed a lot of those wetlands that Canada historically had. The population of beavers was, I believe it was around the 5 million mark. And then after the fur trade, you know, as I mentioned, they were almost wiped to extinction. So the populations have rebounded. They're not listed as a vulnerable or threatened species, but their populations are nowhere near their historical levels. And which is sad. But I'm really encouraged, though, to see that scientists are really sort of propping up the beaver. There's amazing literature out there about their contributions, and there's some great documentaries too. CBC has a really good one about the beaver, narrated by David Suzuki, and there's some beaver documentaries people can find online. But I really encourage people to just take a minute to really learn about these extraordinary animals and what they do for our environment. And an extra step, if people want to take, is to contact their local city, their city councilors, and ask if they trap beavers. I think you'd be surprised to learn many municipalities actively contract trappers to trap and kill so-called nuisance beavers. So we always encourage people to reach out to their community to find out what they're doing as it relates to wildlife control, and if they do in fact use lethal traps to remove animals like beavers. And if that's the case, I encourage your listeners to reach out to us, and we can perhaps work with some of these communities to offer alternatives and to provide some education.
Yeah, just we're kind of out of time, but just as we leave, the fur bearers have had some success working with municipalities and with happy results, right?
Oh, it's been really positive. So the latest example was in my community of Port Alberni. It's on Vancouver Island. There are two sites where beavers were causing some flooding issues. So there's a culvert, which is a big pipe that runs under the road, and beavers were blocking the culvert, raising the water levels that was flooding out the road. And so historically, the town would simply trap and remove the beavers year after year. The fur bearers contacted the city, and with the help of Van Isle Wetlands, which is a local individual who we helped put through the Beaver Institute, we built some pond levelers and some exclusion fencing. It's all it takes. The project, was, I believe it was probably in the realm of about $1,000.
Wow.
And the materials and the labor. And so that site will probably last for about 10 years.
And that just prevents the beaver from going into that area. That
It does. The simplest way to explain it for people is, in my mind, it's a baby gate. You think of a toddler and you don't want them under your sink, or you don't want them accessing stairwells. And so you just simply make it inaccessible. You put up a baby gate. Very similar. So a culvert, if you don't want the beaver in there, you can set up exclusion fencing, and there's certain kind of way to do it, and there's certain kind of gauged fencing and spacing and some technical aspects. But the concept, though, is that the water is able to flow, the fish and debris are able to flow, but the beavers are unable to pack it with sticks and mud. And so what happens is beavers will just typically move on and relocate themselves naturally, or they tend to stay in the area, and then they'll modify their environment to kind of suit this new structure. And so that's the ideal situation. So you get, again, the benefit of the water. So we don't want the beavers to leave necessarily, because we enjoy the water that's there and we need the water. The concern rather is actually not the beavers, it's the water itself and the height of the water. So I think as humans, we tend to always focus and blame the animal, but it's not necessarily the animal that's the problem. It's, in this case, the water. So let's focus on the water and regulate the water while allowing the animal to remain in the area. And that is really, in essence, a broader picture of coexistence. What can we do to modify our behavior and our structures as humans to allow for and to create a tolerance of these individuals who we share this landscape with? And it's just such a fundamental, common sense approach that I wholeheartedly believe in. And I think as humans, there's so many more opportunities and ways in which we can coexist with our wild neighbors, and we have to, we just have to.
Yeah.
And you know, climate change, COVID, all of these things demand that we fundamentally shift our attitudes and perceptions as they relate to our relationship with animals.
Right. Well, thank you again, Lesley, and for all the work you're doing at the Fur Bears. It's thefurbears.com. Is it?
It
Right,
is.
right on. Okay, and you'll have to come back and share some more wonderful information with us sometime. There's so much to learn.
Well, I really appreciate your time. Thank you for everything you're doing and in your capacity, giving the animals a voice. And thanks to everyone who took the time to tune in today. And I hope everyone has a safe and happy summer.